Hey guys, so we're back with part 2 of the video. I know it took a long time to get this out because I was having a lot of technical difficulties, and shout out to the people who have been doing this for years. You lot are the realists, because this is not easy. All the editing and the recording and chopping and changing outfits and I almost had a moment, but we pressed anyway. So in this video I am showing you recap. This is the fabric that we've chosen for the final piece that I'm going to be making, and in this video I will show you how I break the pattern apart. And with this jacket we're going to show you how to use a jacket or a previous item you have in your wardrobe to construct a pattern to then be cut out on the actual fabric. All right, so let's go. This video is quite a long one, so disclaimer, I am so sorry, it's quite a long one, and it's the first time I've ever done a how-to video. I am sure I'll get the hang of it, and the videos from here on out will be a lot shorter, God willing. So I hope you enjoy it. I've done the video with the intention that you can also work along with it. If you have your own jacket and you want to try it at home, feel free to do so. Let's get into this. For this video, you will need a cutting mat, your pattern paper, your pattern drafting rulers, your set square and your curve ruler. Also, you will need the design that you are going to be using for your final garment. My one includes an iPad that I just used for a bit of reference. You'd also need a measuring tape, your pens, one of another color, pencil and a rubber, your awl, AWL, and you will need the item that you're using to draft your pattern from. Okay, so we're drafting the pockets, the patch pockets, also the front, and we're going to be extending that as well to make it a long line jacket. So here we go. First things first, I'm just going to recap so you can see how the jacket is going to be made and the basic design of it. We move on to the back because I don't think I showed you last time. So the back is pretty straightforward. It's a boxy shape. It has a back yoke, oversized sleeves, and also it is split into 3 sections underneath the yoke as well. Right, so we move on, and here we have our pattern pieces all individually drawn, so we know exactly what we need to cut out. Make sure as you are doing them, you are labeling the pattern pieces as you go along. There are 13 pattern pieces in total, and what you will need is a front yoke, side front, center front, patch pocket, top pocket, sleeve, cuff, pocket flap, collar, back yoke, button stand, center back, and a side back. Right, so the first step would be to draw yourself a line down one side of your paper. There's no desired length for this, but just use this as a reference point of where we're going to start this pattern. The next step would be to take your desired garment and line it up with the line that you've previously drawn. I'm now using an instrument that we call an awl to puncture holes through the garment onto the sheet below. Please bear in mind, if you are using a lighter weight fabric, a tracing wheel is probably better for this. As I'm going along, you can see me spreading the garment out to get the accurate shape of it below, and you will do that through the remaining of the jacket, through the armhole, and also along where you can see the yoke. There's a line just above the pocket. But all in all, as you're doing that, make sure the two lines are lined up, because your pattern will be lopsided if the center front line is not kept right. So once you have finished tracing around the front of your jacket with the awl and your pencil, you will now connect the dots that you have popped through the paper, and this should give you a pattern for your front of your jacket. At some points through the video, you can see me trying to find the holes that I've pierced through. They can be a little bit hard to find, so make sure you have a cutting mat placed right under your pattern when you are puncturing the holes through. A cutting mat is essential so that you don't pop through and damage the table below. I've done it before, trust me, and my mum was not happy. So, word of caution, use a cutting mat. So here I am focusing on the side seam. On the original jacket pattern, the side seam dipped in a bit, but because I want a boxy shape, I'm squaring off the side seam from the armhole and I'm going straight down. Next step, because we have punctured holes for our front yoke, we just draw it into place, and also we popped around our pockets. So please don't forget to also include your pockets while you are using the awl to make your marks through onto the paper. Pop through your pocket, your top patch pocket. The bottom one is not so relevant as yet because you can place that wherever you want to place it. When drafting out your pocket, use the center line on the ruler as a guide to make sure that your pocket is symmetrical, because if it's not, you will have a very lopsided pocket. So I'm squaring down, making sure that I'm using center seam as a reference to get the exact point for the bottom of the pocket as well. So the next step is to use your ruler and your pencil and draw a straight line down the middle of the pocket. Extend the line all the way down as far as you can. Before you close off the end of the jacket where the two parallel lines meet, make sure you know exactly how long you want your jacket to be. Mine from the shoulder is 37 inches, so I've squared down and done that. Here you can see me now focusing on making the pockets, the patch pocket for the lower half of the jacket, and I am just making sure that I am following the line that we squared down from, and I'm making sure it's wide enough for my hand to pass through. So as you are drawing the pocket out, remember the line that you drew down from the top pocket to the edge of your jacket. Make sure on either side of that line the measurements are exactly the same. And also when you are squaring down, use the center line to line up with the line that you've previously drawn to square down to the desired length of your pocket. Repeat for the other side as well, and where they meet, then you go down and square them off along the bottom of the pocket. Later on, I realized my pocket was too low and it moved it up to waist height. So now we are focusing on the front button stand, and the button stand is 1.5 centimeters wide. So you will come in from the center front line by 1.5 centimeters, and you make little marks as you go along where you're going to go ahead and line them up a little later. I completely forgot I had a meter ruler, so I grabbed that to make my job a little bit easier, and I just connected all the points that I just marked for my button stand. So at the start of the video, you would have seen the measurements that you would have needed to take for the completion of this jacket. So now we're going to check to see if our bust measurements, our waist and hip measurements are accounted for in what we've drawn so far. the jacket I chose was a little bit small on me and didn't quite reach the center of my bust. So I'm just going to widen the pattern, also to achieve the boxy shape, but to make sure that the jacket fits me, because I don't want a button pop in the middle of me wearing it. So here you can see me making my marks. Right now I'm scaling down from the shoulders to make sure that my waist seam is as wide as it needs to be to accommodate my actual waist. Without using a calculator, you can use your tape measure as a ruler by finding the measurement you need and finding top of the tape measure, folding it to your desired measurement and folding it in half again to get a quarter of your measurement. So we will move on to the hip measurement, and we are just doing the same tape measure method to get our length. So as you can see, it is wider than the pattern that we need, which means from the bust we need about 2 inches extra, but I've added 2.5 just to give it a little bit more room for the boxiness. And we're going to go by the bust and the hip measurement because your waist measurement was inside the actual pattern, so the waist was not the problem, but we're going to add on a little bit more, a 2.5 inch excess. If you watched part 1, you would also see that we wanted the shoulder seam to be extended off the balls of our shoulders slightly. So without measuring the jacket, I decided to add 1.5 extra because I feel like that would come off my shoulders ever so slightly without giving me a square shoulder effect. So we extended the shoulder seam by 1.5 and we extended the side seam by 2.5 inches. Now you use your curved ruler and to connect the points together to get that perfect armhole curve. I've gone and looked at the jacket and I've seen that they have folded over the button stand by the exact amount that it is measuring now. So you have to double up the button stand, and the center front line that was there before now becomes your fold line. So we extend the pattern by 1 inch for the fold over piece. This is the part that goes behind the center front to create the double layer of your button stand. So connect the dots and leave the top as it is. We'll come back to that later. Before moving on to do the other patterns, what we need to do is trace the 2 pocket pieces. So instead of getting pattern paper, I got myself 2 A4 pieces of paper and we're going to trace out our pattern pieces. So we start with tracing out the top flap. You just make points, little dots where the corners are, and then you can just join them together at the end to get your desired piece. I've decided to just add on 1 centimeter seam allowance on it from now instead of doing it with all the others later. So you can either come back to it and add your seam allowance, or you can just do it as you're going along. Remember, there are 2 pieces to a pocket with a flap. So from the end of the yoke line, trace the points out, and then you will connect them as you did with the pocket flap, and also add seam allowance. Remember to label each pattern piece as you are going along, and also mark out your grain line on each pattern. Repeat the same steps for the patch pocket further down the pattern. Also label the pattern, add seam allowance, and also remember to add your grain line. So now we are going to focus on the back of your jacket. Make sure that all your seams are lined up, so when you go to trace it, that you get an accurate measurement. Make sure that you can see every seam that needs to be punctured through or traced before beginning to trace it. So we're going to repeat the same step that we did at the beginning of the video, where we drafted a line from the top of the sheet near to the bottom of the sheet, and this is your reference line for keeping everything straight. Line up the back of the jacket with the line that you have just drawn to keep your jacket straight while you are tracing it. Make sure all your seams are where they are meant to be and begin tracing. This is a little easier than the front because we folded it directly in half. The only bit that you would need to pop through is the armhole, also the back line for the yoke, and also for the seam that comes down from the yoke to the edge of the jacket. So I'm now tracing out the side seam. As you can see, it does curve in slightly from the armhole, but later on in the pattern you will see that we've squared it down as well for the boxy shape. So because the line is straight, I've decided to just mark a mark at the bottom where the line would meet from the top edge of your yoke, and then I will use a ruler to draw down. Now we're going to trace around the back of your pattern, so use the dots that you have now punctured through to create your armhole, the yoke, the shoulder seam and the side seam. Remember to keep in mind that we have also added extra onto the side seams and the armhole, so these will need to be transferred to the back as well. Because your center back is straight, you also need to make sure the beginning of your neckline of the back is straight. So square it off first and then round it off to the shoulders. So here you can see me just marking out the place that I'm going to measure now. Just because I've traced around the back doesn't mean it's exactly accurate. So I'm just checking that the front and the back shoulder seam measurements are the same. Alright, so using the mark from before, we're going to square down from the back of the yoke to create the seam that is on the back of the jacket. Okay, here are the front and back pieces together. You can see the separate lines that separate the back yoke, the back side, the back center, the front side, the center front, and the front yoke. So as you're going along, label all the patterns. What you see me doing here is using the tape measure to measure the armholes of the front and the back, and together they will combine to make the full curve of the sleeve head. So sad to say, the video I recorded for the sleeve was not in focus. It wasn't in the right view and I didn't get all of it on camera. So I'm going to try and walk you through it. So from the measurements that we took of the armholes before, we know that the front is 11 inches and the back is 12.5 inches. Together that makes 23.5. I'm going to try to break it down as much as I can. From the top of the line, you need to grade down by 5 inches. Then from the 5-inch mark, you square across to the width of your bicep. That means you equally divide your bicep, and on either side of the middle line, you draw half of the bicep measurement. After you have marked out your biceps, on the front and the back. Now we're going to focus on the top half of the sleeve where the curve is, which is called the head of the sleeve. On the front side, your curve needs to be 11 inches. That is 11 inches from the top middle point of the sleeve to the end half of where your bicep is. On the back side of the sleeve, the curve needs to be 12.5 inches, which means from the middle point to the end of the sleeve on the back side, it needs to be a curve of 12.5 inches. At the end of that, take your tape measure and line it up with the curve to see the total is 23.5. So the next step you would need is your wrist measurement. To get the overlap for the button and buttonhole, whatever your wrist measurement is, you need to add 2.5 inches to it, divide it by 2, and draw the measurement on either side of the line to get your full wrist measurement. Now you've drawn that line, connect where the end of the bicep line is and grade down to where the wrist line is, and now you have a full sleeve pattern. So we will move on to the cuff. Whatever the bottom of the sleeve width is, the cuff length needs to be the same width. Because I left enough space under my pattern, you will see that I am now just grading down to get a more accurate measurement. The cuff is a total of 4 inches in height. That is 2 inches on the front and then 2 inches folded over to the back when the cuff is fully made up. Here I am just making sure I can show you dominant lines that you can see exactly what I'm doing. So that is 4 inches by your wrist measurement plus 2.5 inches. To make sure you don't forget the fold line, you can take a bold pen and emphasize the fold line, which is 2 inches on the top and 2 inches on the bottom. So just divide your cuff in half. Moving on, we will now focus on drafting the pattern for your collar. So you take the full collar and you fold it in half, and this is on the original jacket that you're copying from. And the folded edge, you place it on a straight line, or because I have crosses on my paper, I just line it up with the dots and crosses there, and I begin tracing the outer edge. On the curve of the neckline where I can't have access, I will then grab the awl and puncture holes through it. As you can see, I forgot all about the mat at this point, and the table had a few lovely holes in it by the end of it. So yeah, so draw that out, neat, tidy, and very accurate, because once you get the curve wrong, it's hard to reset it sometimes. So be very careful as you're doing this. Also remember to label all your patterns as you're going along. Last but not least, add seam allowance to all the pieces that need seam allowance on them. Please label them. Remember the pieces that need to be cut and fold, and the pieces that needs to be doubled or cut in pairs, symmetrical pairs, and add seam allowance to all of those as well. Also, not forgetting that on the hemline of the front and back pieces, you need to add an inch on the bottom halves. As you can see here, I clearly made a mistake and added 1 centimeter instead of an inch on the front, but on your one you can correct that and add 1 centimeter along the bottom edge of the front and back pieces. So once you have added seam allowance, go back to your front pattern and cut the armhole out and down the sides, but please pause for the front because there's additional instructions that are needed for the front. So now we focus on the front section, and on the seam allowance line that you've added on in the front, cut all the way up. Don't cut the curve as yet, because remember the front has a fold line, and there's a crafty little trick here as to how to get the perfect curve when you fold back your button stand. So you add seam allowance to where the fold line is, all the way up the neckline to the top of the shoulder. All right. Now to focus on the button stand, take your pattern and fold it in half on the line that we deemed as the fold line. Okay, the bit that is folded to the back, make sure it is bang on the line. As you flip the pattern back to the front, using the seam allowance that you've done, cut along the seam allowance, also cutting through the folded edge at the back. When the pattern is unfolded, you will now see a sharp pointed edge. There's no need to add seam allowance to this because it's already there. I'm just emphasizing mine. So when you fold it back, it is a perfect curve, but when it's open, it is a pointed edge. This is your complete front pattern piece. This now needs to be divided into segments. On the center front line, cut down. Remember, that again, includes the folded over edge of the button stand. You should have about 2.5 inches of button stand to cut off. Also, cut the yoke away from the main body of the top, and then down the faint line that we drew, cut right through the pockets because you've already traced them out, so that doesn't matter. You should now have 4 pieces that you can now add seam allowance to. Where I'm pointing to is where you need to add seam allowance. Because I don't like to waste paper, I've had scraps of paper that I'm now just gonna attach to the sides that need seam allowance and sellotape them on, cut my seam allowance off, and I will have new patterns with seam allowance. If you don't want to do it this way because it's tedious, you can also grab new pattern paper and trace out your patterns from through the paper, so you can put the paper over your patterns and trace them out and then add seam allowance like that. Here I'm showing you all the final pattern pieces with all the seam allowances added, all the labels, all the straight grains added to them, ready to be cut out in the desired fabric. I am so excited that I've come to this point, and I cannot wait to show you lot the next stage of this process, where we'll be taking it to the fabric and the sewing machine and constructing an amazing garment. So check back in for part 3, where I make a full jacket for you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to subscribe. If you want to see part 3, remember to turn on the notification bell. Also follow me on my social handles. Love you all. God bless.